What is Sweden doing about its anti-Israel problem? Is there a connection between anti-Jewish hate crimes and anti-Israel activism in Sweden? Is there something unique in the history and political character of Sweden that makes this country different in its approach to Jews and to Israel? This is Barry Shaw from the Israel Institute of Strategic Studies, and this is The View from Israel. We'll be examining all these issues and more, and to help me make sense of it all, I'm delighted to have Susanne Sznajderman-Rytz to help me diagnose the problem. Welcome, Susan, to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Look, I know you've been involved in Zionist and Jewish affairs in Sweden for many years. Tell me about your background and what positions you hold today.
So the background is, like many my age, it started as a youth movement and you involved in Jewish organizations. And then you continue with Jewish community work. Since I was 25, which is quite many years ago, I've been involved in women's issues and also part of the WITSO Sweden Federation. And the position of a president of WITSO Sweden I've been holding for more than 10 years now. And that also, of course, involves Jewish activities within Sweden, in Europe, internationally, and also for the Jewish communities on the same scale for different purposes. So my interest in these things is that WITSO is a Zionist women's movement, and we are very much part of AntiIsrael, and we care about the situation of Israel in the world, in Europe, and also, of course, in Sweden.
You recently had an important event in Sweden. It was the International Forum on Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Antisemitism. Just talk about that event, and it seemed to be significant to me that it was held in Malmo and not in your capital, Stockholm.
That, of course, explains why our Prime Minister, who is now resigning, wanted to have an event to, how would you say, make his departure more important and to show that Malmö will have a changed direction. And the city of Malmö had to host this event in order to be inspired for the probably change of politics in Sweden. But it's also a household name for anti-Semitism, not only in Sweden, but also in Europe. Malmö is, I think, today the most known city within this context.
Yep. Tell me also about the organization of this conference, because I understand from my distance over here, looking at it, it didn't seem to be an amazing success. I understand that it was supposed to be a 3-day conference. It ended up as a 1-day conference. Tell me about the participation or lack of participation of Scandinavian ministers who maybe have expressed the desire to come but didn't come. So who were the people who came and who was there? What was the general result, do you feel, of this conference?
Well, let's see it in the perspective that it was planned for last year. And because of the pandemic, it was postponed. And now, as it seemed, it was also a question of who will attend and who will not attend up to the moment when the United Conference on Durban was held in August. A lot of Jewish organizations hesitated, and also people in the political sphere, to join the conference in Malmö, as Sweden had not denounced its participation in the Durban conference in New York till the very last minute. And it was never officially given a reason for why Sweden denounced. But I think this was politics playing out in order to have other representatives arrive to this conference in Malmo, and then Sweden had to accept that they needed to refrain from taking part in the Durban conference in order to have some representation at least for Malmö. So Isaac Herzog very early said that he will represent from the state of Israel, but that's not a political representation. The Nordic countries did not represent by ministers of the same level, and also a lot of Jewish organizations did not attend and did not even, I think, send, which is very common in this, some kind of text or some kind of confirmation that they back the Swedish initiative. It's also considered important that Sweden for the next year is going to share the IRA work. So that was partly how the European organizations played in. And Macron, I think at the very last minute, accepted the invitation to be from afar, and also did the Israeli government, I think, at the very end, also had to have a virtual stop.
We were very disappointed over here in Israel of the lack of enthusiasm, let me put it that way, of the Jewish organizations in Sweden. I don't know if you can explain that to me. The other question I'll throw in here to answer as well is, has in Sweden, or from this conference you had in Malmo, was the notion of adopting the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism actually adopted, and has the Swedish government adopted?
It's signed. That is a very important thing to understand, that it was a Swedish initiative to start with 20 years ago. So the Swedish government has signed the IRA document, but there is no strategy on the table on how to implement it. And that's the weak part of it.
The problem then is to have the Swedish government contact other governments, including the United States, Great Britain, other European countries that have adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. This is crucially important, especially in the aftermath of an international forum on Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism.
In Sweden, it's a very rare situation because the government officially has, of course, signed the IRA declaration. But on the same day as this announced and talking about this conference, Swedish journalists give a discussion in the Swedish radio on the Jerusalem Declaration, which is a different, how would you say, a different kind of perspective on the Jewish state. And that seemed steamed up by left politics.
Yes, I appreciate the difference, but this is why left politics must not be the ones who decide what the internationally recognized definition of anti-Semitism is, because the internationally recognized definition of anti-Semitism does include picking on Israel, the Jewish state, and treating it differently to all other countries. And it's understandable to me why the left and why others will not want the Swedish government to adopt this definition, one that is being adopted by increasing numbers of democratic countries. And this is an essential issue, I think. And it brings us, I think, on to addressing the issue of how anti-Semitism, how Jew hatred in Sweden expresses itself. Do you have any views on this you'd like to share with us?
Well, it's a very tough question. The start is that since 1968, the Swedish media, journalists, reporters, public service has had a tremendous influence by left politics. That has been supported by the government, which means that the social democratic parties and their allies have never put a difference between their own politics and the media. It's very intertwined. And that means also that the social democratic, I would say the government and the social democratic party are also part of, since the turn of the century, the year 2000, of the politics within the church. One should not forget that the church has inherited anti-Semitism for centuries. And it has to do also with the Muslim Brotherhood that has been now intertwined with church politics. And it's very hard to separate governmental politics, left media, and the Swedish church. Three partners who share a view of maybe supporting the weak part, if that should be the Palestinians, and giving Jews and Israel a hard time.
I can't help but feel, because I've been studying this subject for way over 20 years, that in Sweden, and in my opinion, or shamingly, some of the Jewish organizations in Sweden are refusing to face the truth directly in its face. Yes, of course, there are right-wing anti-Semites in Sweden, as there are in other countries, including other Scandinavian countries. Quite right that anti-Semitism is openly expressed when it's done by so-called neo-Nazis or white supremacists or whatever you want to call them. But I would bet the farm on the fact that if you can, or anybody can give real full statistics of the hate crimes conducted in Sweden last year, this year, the year before, I think you will find that yes, there are hate crimes conducted by the far right, and there are even more, I would suggest, and I find statistics in other countries to back it up, but I can't get any information, accurate information, out of Sweden, that in fact the majority of hate crimes against Jews in Sweden are conducted by Muslims and Islamists and people from the Middle East. I want to give you one example before I hand it over to you. I have here a statement from the president of the Swedish Jewish Central Council saying that he was concerned by the gains made by the right-wing parties in the country's recent election. Yet, if I go back in time, 3 Syrians and a Palestinian assailant were arrested some years ago for the firebombing of a synagogue in Gothenburg and in Malmo, as I relate in my book as well. It was mainly the Muslims and people from the Middle East who were not only demonstrating pro-Palestinian, let them be pro-Palestinian, but when it came to being anti-Semitic in their pro-Palestinianism or anti-Israel hatredism, there you have the hybrid twin of anti-Israel and anti-Jewish hatred linked together. As if you follow my example, you will find it there under the surface all the time. You mentioned Malmo. In the book that I wrote, by the way, it's called Fighting Hamas, BDS and Anti-Semitism. You're actually included in the book. But I make the case of the mayor of Malmo at that time, where not only did he tolerate, almost encourage, and he was a left-wing mayor of Malmo, Though when the Jewish community decided to have a demonstration in support of Israel, he in fact condemned them. He told them virtually that you have to decide what side you're on, because if the Jews are going to openly support Israel, there's very little he can do to defend them. That basically, in a nutshell, was the message of Elam, the mayor of Malmo at that time, and Ripolu, the socialist mayor, saying, you know, you have to either stand with his political view or take the consequences. I think that's a very dangerous situation that even a mayor, never mind a government, put Jews under when they want to express themselves.
You are absolutely right. And that's a very complex question, because the Jewish communities in Sweden do have a problem confronting the government with these questions and issues. So for a long time, there has been dialogues, good intentions, I would say, to try to have solutions to this. But it's very, to me, odd that the few Jews in Sweden, less maybe than 10,000 active within the communities and different organizations, should be part of the solution to the state policy. And if the state policy is to not register hate crimes, not put these people to confrontation and to give them punishment for what they have been doing. In these cases, hate crime is illegal, but there are no consequences to it. So, of course, the Jewish community will be part of the problem for the state, but expected to be part of the solution, which is it's an impossible equation.
I have to admit something to you, Susan. I mentioned earlier, I wrote about you in the book I mentioned, Fighting Hamas, BDS, and Antisemitism. And as I mentioned, everything that I predicted there is come true. But in this book, you spoke about what you called, at that time, the bad atmosphere surrounding Jews in Sweden and in other European countries. But then you said in Sweden, people self-censor themselves. They hear anti-Semitism, but do not act because they don't feel safe in reacting. Tell me what you mean by that.
I must tell you and I'm very worried about that, because that self-censorship has even expanded. So Jewish media, which is a very limited media, Jewish communities, Jewish organizations are rarely speaking out for the actual situation here. I think they hide behind Swedish politicians. They go out to Facebook and Instagram and all these social media and express themselves, but there is no open conversation on the topic of how the Jewish communities are now struggling in order to keep their solidarity and identity, and how you would say, express their will to support the state of Israel. It has been a little better when it comes to the representatives of the Jewish communities in their meetings with governmental bodies, where they do explain that this is part of a very heavy situation for Jews in Sweden. But they don't ask for action.
Yes, you Look, you went on at that time to say at that time that you felt that what you call Sweden's quick recognition of a Palestinian state outside of a negotiated solution gave, in your words, courage to the Palestinians and those who are violent and to Muslims in our country to act. And this strategy is very dangerous. I think by that you meant that it was unwise of the Swedish government to recognize a Palestinian state before the Palestinians themselves have united both factions, both the one in Ramallah and the one in Gaza, in actually taking jointly the pathway to peace. But I'll let you explain it in your words, what you meant at that time, and whether your words are still relevant today.
Well, I thank you for asking, because this is actually part of a huge, complicated situation right now. The Swedish government, at that time, when they did give the Palestinians their, support by naming them a state, they thought the European Union would follow, and they would then be looked upon as very brave and interesting, and they would be honored for that. This did not happen. The European Union, refrained from supporting Sweden. And now Sweden will be the shiny example of a failure. So this really makes it even harder for the Swedish government, who have so heavily invested in this, to back from that. They needed to send Margot Wallström, who was then the foreign minister, away. She had to resign in order to change this officially. But she said at that time that she blamed the Israeli state for all the terror in Europe, and especially for the Charlie Hebdo. I met her in the street, and she didn't know who I was, and I asked her, "How come you blame Israel for the deeds in Paris?" And her answer was, "The Jews are campaigning against me." So this was by then the official picture, that Sweden did the right thing to support the Palestinians. The European Union did not back Sweden on that, and solely Sweden is now promoting which will maybe be the two-state solution, in order to continue this strategy. Sweden has heavily invested in the Palestinian authorities, extremely done so, not only by governmental aid, but also by aid through the church and many NGOs.
I think there's a well-known expression of the Stockholm Syndrome. This is what happens when people rob a bank or something and hold hostages for a long siege process. Sometimes the hostages identify with the criminals rather than the people who are coming to try and rescue them. And I felt for some time, and correct me if I'm wrong, that I think that Sweden is suffering from its own sort of Stockholm Syndrome. Let me explain what I mean by this. And I'm being frankly honest here, because we've seen it in other places. Sweden is one of those countries that have been very generous, and because of its welfare system, has been very attractive to economic migrants from Eastern Europe, perhaps also, and certainly from the Middle East as well. And you welcomed all these people into your, who have come to your very generous social welfare system, and expected they would, in fact, integrate into society and become assimilated Swedes, call their kids names like Anders and Astrid, and this didn't happen. And instead, you now have a society, a larger and expanding community within Sweden with their own names, their own culture, their own norms, and their own ways of doing things that they did in the Middle East that maybe a lot of people in Sweden are finding very strange, even alien to regular Swedes, as I said. And there are, I know, although probably your media don't cover it as fully as they should, there are all sorts of gruesome crimes in Sweden that were unknown 15, 20 years ago and perpetrated by the sort of people that I'm talking about. I think what countries like Sweden didn't appreciate that, for example, and we see it all the time, people do not leave the Middle East for Sweden. They bring the Middle East with them into Sweden. Now, you may say it's very nice, they can bring in their own sort of costumes and clothing, and they bring their own diets and things like that. They bring their own music, but there's also other things that they bring into the country that are not what I would have called traditional Swedish values. They take your benefits and they fail to fully integrate. They remain separate from the mainstream. They build their own societies based on their norms within even the main towns. Now, for instance, do you have any what we would call no-go areas in Sweden?
You are absolutely right. And now it has appeared that the normal Swede, my neighbor or people I meet at work, have realized that the multiculturalism that was celebrated in Sweden has turned out to created a parallel system. As you say, it starts with small pockets of immigrants who start their own shops. They have these now no-go zones where we call the ambulances and the fire brigade and police are not welcomed. And this is something that has only, I think, the last few years become an awareness among the Swedish citizens that these people will develop, and they are by now 10% of the Swedish population. They will develop their own laws, they will have their own police, and they will set up their own social system. And I don't think the Swedish government expected that. As you say, they brought their own, not only religion, but also cultural values and systems, how to create their own communities. And they will not, as the Swedish immigrants did, be part of an integrational policy.
Let me corroborate what I said about my impression. I would like the clear statistics to back it up, but where I say that most of the anti-Semitic crimes in Sweden, the crimes against Jews in Sweden, also the rising movement against Israel, which I mentioned before, is a hybrid symbiosis of the two hatreds wrapped into one. Israel being the collective Jew, of course. That
yeah.
We mentioned Malmo before, and in my book, then, and I would suspect the situation is worse today. I quote the head of the Malmo Jewish community, who at the time of that demonstration, where the anti-Israel movement were marching on the street, calling death to Israel and from a nation from the river to the sea, and the Jewish community wanted to have a pro-Israel demonstration, that the head of the Malmo Jewish situation, according from the book here, told a news agency that most of the anti-Semitic incidents are perpetrated by Muslims or Arabs. And that was not from me, that was the head of the Malmo Jewish community at that time, who was on the spot. But this brings me to another thing. But what has happened in Sweden as a result of this is that you have all these people migrating into Sweden with these sort of notions of against Jews, these notions against the Jewish state, and they're taken up by politicians, both at city level and national level, particularly those of the left, who see in this rising population an opportunity for gaining more political power, and they appease these groups by adopting their messages. If their messages have been true, fine. but quite often their messages, in fact, almost all the time, their messages are wrong, and they're hiding the truth of Palestinian terrorists and Palestinian intentions of having a state instead of Israel and not doing it together. In other words, there's a lot of exploitation going on here, where a lot of politicians in Sweden are feeding off this hatred and helping it develop. What's your attitude to that?
I wish I could say I had a different impression. That would be very nice. I have not. We have now schools that are not only economically supported by foreign policy, by foreign organizations, by the Muslim brotherhoods abroad, and for different purposes, the Muslim communities are very aggressive in how they want to move into the school system, into how the legal system is working. And they are also part of, as you say, the political arena where they capture positions, where they have influence. And that goes to the left party for sure, but also to the Social Democrats and to the center parties. So within this framework, they have already gained a lot of power, which is used, of course, it's used for confronting the Swedish norm of most establishment. And they are pushing borders within this work of political engagement, social engagement, and also intertwined with left politics.
And I think this is also been adopted by much of the media, who are also being the megaphone, if you like, for a lot of anti-Israel lies and everything that's been taken by the people who are now not even fully integrated, I would say, into Sweden itself. So much so that the politicians are now getting into power, who are representing these interests. And the Swedish government now is funding many anti-Israel NGOs. In 2020, for instance, Sweden gave about 20 million euro to Palestinian NGOs engaged in anti-Israel conflict under the guise of relief and aid money. Recently, for instance, the Israeli defense minister declared 6 Palestinian NGOs who have been funded by Sweden as being terror organization. I'm doing a different program, by the way, with an expert on this, who will be itemizing the crimes of the Palestinian NGOs being funded by the Swedish government and by Swedish charities and by Swedish so-called human rights organizations, because these Palestinian NGOs go by very, very nice sounding names about women organization, children's organization, human rights organizations, or whatever. And they're deeply embedded with, for instance, if not Hamas, on the other side of the equation, what's called the Popular Front for the Palestinian, for the Liberation of Palestine, which is seated in Ramallah, and is still dedicated on a Palestinian state from the river to the sea. And Swedish taxpayers paying on this. I want to, before I ask for your response to this, I want to raise one thing because I'm involved in this. On the other hand, when we have Israeli NGOs who want to submit evidence to the Swedish government of the crimes of these NGOs that the Swedish government and their money and also Swedish charities are giving, they are rejected. I'm talking about, for instance, NGO Monitor, the Center for Near East Studies, talk about the UNRWA school books that teach hatred and incitement and anti-Semitism, whether it's Palestine Media Watch or whether it's the Israeli Institute of Strategic Studies. We don't get the millions of euros that, for instance, Sweden is giving to the Swedish and other NGOs who are working with the Palestinian NGOs, who are simply a part of the arms of terror organizations here in the Palestinian entities. And it seems to me, as I pass it over to you, that there seems to be a willing blindness here to understand and hear and receive factual documents which will actually save Swedish taxpayers' money, because the Swedish people knew how badly spent their money is being sent over here, they would be protesting against the government.
I really don't know where to start, but you are absolutely right in your analysis. This means, and this is also hard to confront, this means that now there's a charm campaign between the new government of Israel towards Sweden and the new foreign minister of Sweden visiting Israel, where on the surface it seems that all these questions have been swept under the carpet for the moment, and we are not addressing them. I thought the right order would have been to first clear the table and say, this is where we stand. Where do we go from here? So the problem is that all these organizations that are obviously pouring millions into these terrorist organizations who are threatening the state of Israel and its existence are not part of the discussion. That only comes from and that is the weak point of it, from our right politicians who have posed these questions and not been answered by the government. Then this is a status quo that no one is today approaching and discussing, and it's definitely not part of media, the media light. So we, I think, are terrified by this frozen situation, that Sweden is not backing off, not opening up a dialogue on how to correct this. And when our foreign minister from Sweden now visited Ramallah, she had some kind of intention of asking for how this money has been used and some kind of report on that, and asking them to show when elections will come. So this is today, I think, the weakest link in the relationship between Israel and the state of Israel and Sweden, because the charm offensive is now turning a blind eye to all these questions.
Yes, I mean, there are some things that, in my opinion, Sweden has to drop and leave behind. You once had a environmental minister by the name of Mehmet Kaplan, who took part in the infamous Mavi Marmara Turkish ship, that really the provocative act. And you also have a newspaper, for instance, I don't know how you pronounce it, but it seems to me to be a left-wing newspaper, Aftonbladet, who accused Israeli soldiers of killing Palestinian young men in order to steal their organs. And they also printed a cartoon showing two stereotyped Jewish people with the caption, "Hitler killed the wrong Jews." This isn't, I understand, a far right-wing neo-Nazi newspaper. I understand Aftonbladet is a left-wing newspaper.
It's a social democratic left-wing newspaper. And you are absolutely right. There has been no correction. There is no different policies, no difference in strategies here. This is business as usual. So even if the government has now tried to have a different view on Israel as a partner and not an opponent, how would you say that? But the media is still very influenced by earlier Swedish politics, and continuously so. We have two foreign correspondents in Israel and in the Middle East who absolutely are on a daily basis infusing into the Swedish public service, the radio stations and the TV stations, the same politics as before. The Israeli state is the threat to the Palestinians.
Susanne, I really feel from over here in Israel that it appears to us over here that Sweden has to refine its moral honesty and courage. Sweden, for us in Israel, has been a place for Jews everywhere. It was represented by Raoul Wallenberg, who was really a notable Swede. Tell our viewers a little bit about Raoul Wallenberg.
So, this was a courageous Swede who during wartime in Budapest, by giving passports to Jews who could by that save their lives, leave Hungary during wartime, he saved thousands and thousands and maybe 10,000s of people's lives. His name and his legacy is today worldwide renowned. So his work has been appreciated, and he has been I think, the most significant symbol for one man can make a huge difference. He was not alone, but he had help from a secretary and a few other people, but he really made that moral stand that one person can make a difference. His family, when he got caught at the end of the war by the Russians, tried to have the Swedish government to interact with the Russians and have him released, or at least have his destiny told. Where was he? How was he captured? And why did the Russians finally put him to the Lublanka prison? This was never in the interest during the 50s from the Swedish government to find out and to help the family to have news about him. Only recently has the government reacted. His name is today the name of streets and places, and in front of the United Nations building in New York, very much put in a broader concept of humanity. But in the Swedish Academy of Raoul Wallenberg, who is spreading his work and also working in his spirit today, weren't even invited to the conference in Malmo. I spoke to them the other week, as I'm also involved in an organization for educational on the Holocaust. And they felt very much sorry for not being part of this whole conference where making a difference was the idea of the whole conference.
Well, Sweden today seems to be a long way from the Sweden of Raoul Wallenberg, a Swede of, as you said, rare moral honesty and courage, at least so far as the Jewish population is concerned. But I want to thank you, Susanne, for your moral courage and your honesty. Israel needs, Jews need, Sweden needs more honest people like you to speak up. Your voice is only too rare in Sweden, and I beg other rational, traditional Swedes to rally to you and help you in your cause. Thank you very much for joining me, Susan. Thank you.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity, and all the best. Thanks for your...
I look forward to following your work, and stay in touch with me. I'm here to help any way that we can over here. Thank you.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, when you see this, please share this important video. People like me, people like Susanne need you to spread the message. This is Barry Shaw from The View from Israel signing off. Thank you.